Today's video is going to be a little bit different than usual. I'm in Alberta this week visiting family, and as a result, we are working with even tighter production timelines than usual. But because we didn't want to leave you all with nothing, we decided to try something new instead. So this video is going to be covering 5 true crime stories on a single theme. 4 of these cases are some of our favorites from previous videos we've done, but the first one is completely new. And just a heads up, even the older stories are ones we've never done on camera previously, and all of them have been completely re-edited. Oh yeah, and as for today's theme, it's whatever you do, don't look in the basement. As always, my name is Nigel, I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. Also, let us know what you thought of this special compilation in the comments section below. With that out of the way, let's dive in. On the morning of January 3rd, 2016, a woman in New York City named Julia McCall was in a great mood. That day, she had plans to see one of her best friends, 39-year-old Andrea Carruth. The pair were going to meet up for brunch near Andrea's home in the Bronx. Now, this was pretty standard for the two of them. At least once a month, Julia and Andrea liked to head out and do something fun, like go to a spa or do a little shopping. But that particular day, Julia was especially eager to catch up. Andrea was 5 months pregnant with her first child, and because of the recent Christmas holidays, it had been a little while since she'd gotten the latest news about how everything was going. Julia could not have been happier for her friend. Andrea was one of the kindest and most genuine people she'd ever met, and she knew she was going to be an amazing mother. Honestly, it was kind of wild that she didn't already have kids, because children were Andrea's entire life. Andrea ran a daycare out of her home in the Bronx's Baychester neighborhood. The daycare was very well known in the community and had a great reputation, mostly because Andrea was dedicated not just to looking after the kids, but also to teaching them. Andrea was originally from the tiny Caribbean island of St. Vincent, and education was very important to her. Speaking from personal experience, I don't find this to be that surprising. Half of my family is from Trinidad, and based on everyone I've interacted with from this part of the world, it seems like a big emphasis is placed on education, especially with some of the islands that were former British colonies. A lot of them actually have schooling systems that are directly modeled after the British system as well. Anyway, Andrea had immigrated to the United States when she was in her early 20s. She came with her father, William, who helped her get on her feet and purchase her house. Since then, Andrea had worked incredibly hard building up her daycare. The actual finances of the business were always secondary to Andrea, though. First and foremost, she wanted kids to have access to a good place to learn. For example, even if she knew there was a person in the community who couldn't afford what she was charging, Andrea would still allow them to bring their children. And as a symbol of what she was trying to do, she named her daycare Kitty College. So yeah, for years, Andrea's friends and family members had been asking her, when are you going to have kids of your own? Particularly because she'd been in a committed relationship for a long time. For the last 15 years, she'd been with a man named Lincoln Grant. Lincoln was also from St. Vincent, and by all accounts, he and Andrea were very happy together. But apparently, it was one of those situations where you could tell Andrea kind of wanted to move forward, but Lincoln wasn't really ready. Well, that had changed recently when Andrea and Lincoln announced the pregnancy and the fact that they'd gotten engaged. Soon afterwards, Lincoln moved into Andrea's house where her dad, William, also had a little apartment. With all that said, you can see why Julia was looking forward to catching up with Andrea that day. There was so much happening for her friend, and it was all very exciting. She was watching Andrea's dreams come true, and she just wanted to be there for as much of it as possible. Unfortunately, though, Andrea would not get the fairy tale ending that everyone had hoped. In fact, this whole situation was about to turn into a horrifying nightmare. That morning, which was a Sunday, Julia phoned Andrea right after finishing church. When they had talked before and made plans, she said she would pick Andrea up, so she was calling to make sure she was ready to go. To Julia's surprise, though, Andrea didn't answer. She tried phoning back repeatedly, but call after call went to voicemail. Now, Andrea had never stood Julia up before, so this was definitely weird. But as I said earlier, lately Andrea had had a lot more going on. Julia wondered if maybe Andrea didn't actually want to hang out, and she was blowing her off to spend time at home with Lincoln. This thought kind of annoyed her, but she figured there really wasn't anything she could do. She kind of passive-aggressively texted Andrea saying, "Look, I'm going home. If you still want to go to brunch, you know where to find me." With that, she went on with the rest of her Sunday. Initially, it seemed like Julia's anger was validated when the next morning, around 7 a.m., she heard her phone ring. When she looked at the caller ID, she could see that it was Andrea. Julia was still annoyed about the day before, and she didn't feel like hearing any excuses, so she just ignored it. The calls kept coming in, and Julia continued ignoring them, until she saw that she also had a message. That's when she learned it wasn't Andrea trying to get a hold of her. It was Lincoln. He was saying that Andrea hadn't come home last night, and he had no idea where she was. Immediately, Julia called Lincoln and was like, "What do you mean Andrea didn't come home last night?" Lincoln said, "Yeah, actually, I haven't seen her since yesterday morning. I kind of thought she was with you because of your brunch plans." That's when Julia said, "No, Lincoln, Andrea isn't with me. In fact, she never showed up yesterday." As you might imagine, Julia was really starting to freak out now. But at the same time, the more she talked to Lincoln, the less she understood what was going through his head. For starters, Lincoln knew that Andrea was completely devoted to her daycare. She had a whole weekly routine and stuff she prepared on Sundays in order to be ready for the kids on Monday mornings. So even if Lincoln thought that they had been together, it made no sense that Andrea would have spent the night at Julia's house. Even more baffling, though, was that Lincoln was calling Julia from Andrea's cell phone. So she was thinking to herself, how could he not have thought it was weird that she supposedly went out but didn't take her phone with her? After hearing all of this, Julia told Lincoln, "You need to contact the police." He said okay, and he called right after this conversation. But pretty quickly, his behavior would set off alarm bells again. So after realizing that Andrea was missing, a bunch of her loved ones, as well as community members, immediately sprang into action and began searching for her. However, many of them started to notice that the police response was severely lacking. Growing both worried and impatient, Julia decided to take things into her own hands. She called the local news to alert as many people as possible to Andrea's disappearance. But she also reached out to police directly herself. While speaking with a detective, Julia was told that Lincoln had already called and reported Andrea missing. The detective said that they were sorry, but there really wasn't anything they could do, since Andrea was an adult and there was no indication she was in any danger. Of course, Julia was understandably outraged by this and said, "How can you say that based on the circumstances here?" Well, it turned out that when Lincoln called and made his report, he'd left out some pretty crucial information. Most notably, he'd neglected to mention that Andrea was 5 months pregnant. As soon as police heard this, as well as the stuff about her phone being left behind, they immediately sent a team out to Andrea's house. By the time all of this happened and investigators arrived, another day had passed. It was now the morning of Tuesday, January 5th, and no one had seen Andrea in nearly 48 hours. There was another layer to this that was initially extra concerning. The weather had been particularly frigid the past few days. It was cold enough that a person on their own wouldn't have lasted long if they were out wandering around. But as police started looking more into the details of what had happened here, they began to doubt if Andrea had ever really left the house at all. You see, as officers did their first sweep of the residence, they realized that Andrea's cell phone was far from the only suspicious personal item that had been left behind. All of her winter clothes were still there, and sitting right next to her phone on her bedroom table was her wallet and keys. Fearing the worst, police brought in a cadaver dog, and they took the canine all over the property, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. With that, investigators turned their attention towards Lincoln. Obviously, they had quite a few questions, including why he had waited nearly 24 hours to alert anyone to his fiance's disappearance, and what he had been doing all of January 3rd when Andrea actually went missing. Lincoln told detectives that Sunday he and Andrea had slept in. He estimated that she got out of bed sometime around 10 a.m., but he ended up turning back over and dozing off again. By the time he woke up for real, it was about 3 p.m. The rest of Lincoln's story was the same as what he told Julia. When he got out of bed and realized Andrea wasn't at the house, he assumed that she was still at brunch. He claimed that it wasn't until the following morning that he really started to get worried. Detectives didn't know if they really believed Lincoln. They wondered if something had happened between him and Andrea on January 3rd. Maybe there was some kind of infidelity in the relationship. Or, even darker, maybe Lincoln didn't want the baby. When police spoke to other people close to Andrea about Lincoln, they got mixed information. Many of Andrea's friends said that as far as they knew, she and Lincoln were both happy in the relationship. Even Julia, who obviously had her concerns considering Lincoln's behavior, stated that Andrea never had a bad word to say about her fiancé. Lincoln was much more quiet and reserved than Andrea, but he was a hard worker and seemed like a decent guy. However, Andrea's father, William, who, remember, actually lived at the house with them, said that he was suspicious. He told investigators that Lincoln had come to his apartment inside the property asking where Andrea was. William said he thought something about the interaction was very strange. At this point, investigators didn't know what to believe. They were still convinced that Andrea could not have gone far, but after talking to William, they wondered if Lincoln knew more than what he was letting on. Well, it was around this time that they would make 2 discoveries inside of Andrea's home. And it was these discoveries that would finally reveal the awful truth about what was going on here. So, it's important to know that even though police had searched Andrea's property several times and found nothing, they were continuously doing sweeps of the house. And it was during one of these passes that they noticed something very interesting. Or should I say, the lack of something. Remember how I said Andrea's cell phone, wallet, and keys were all on her bedroom table when police initially arrived on January 5th? Well, now they were gone. Sometime in the last few hours, all of these items had disappeared. Because of how locked down the scene was, there were really only a couple of people who would have had access to them. And based on everything that had happened up until now, the first person detectives suspected was Lincoln. They soon discovered that their hunch was correct. When they spoke to him over the phone, he admitted that he had taken Andrea's stuff with him to work. He claimed that this was for safekeeping, but investigators didn't buy this. They immediately went down to the construction site where he was and took him in for questioning. Now, obviously at this point, things were not looking good for Lincoln Grant. Police wondered if he had taken Andrea's phone, wallet, and keys because he was trying to dispose of evidence. Still, when investigators actually started talking to Lincoln more, his demeanor surprised them. He was totally fine about turning over all of Andrea's belongings. And as strange as some of his actions had been, he seemed genuinely worried about her. The whole thing was extremely confusing. That was, until detectives learned about that second discovery I mentioned. So, back at Andrea's house, while other members of the investigative team were continuing their sweeps and looking for Andrea's personal items, a couple of them started to notice something. It was a strange smell, and not a pleasant one either. Understandably, this concerned them, but the problem was they were only getting whiffs of it. They couldn't quite place where the odor was coming from. It was almost like it was moving around. This had continued to bother police until someone figured it out. There was a way that all of these rooms that they had thoroughly checked were connected through the vents that led to the central heating system in the basement. Speaking of the basement, there's something else I haven't told you yet. This is also where Andrea's father's apartment was located. Of course, investigators had been into William's apartment a couple of times by this point, but it had not been searched as much as the rest of the house. On top of this, something which had previously been overlooked, but which now seemed very significant, was that each time officers had entered the basement during their sweeps, William was burning incense. Sure enough, when detectives went down there and told William to put out the incense, that foul odor they'd noticed got much stronger. And it was very clearly coming from further in the back of the basement, specifically from the furnace room. After heading into the furnace room, investigators noticed a closet. Upon first glance, it looked totally normal inside, but as they started removing items, that began to change. It turned out that there was a blue tarp covering part of the closet floor. Underneath it was a piece of plywood, which was concealing a hole. When detectives removed the wood, they were immediately hit with the overwhelming stench of death and decay. Sadly, inside the hole, partially covered by gravel and dirt, was the body of Andrea Carruth. It was later revealed that Andrea had died due to a combination of ligature strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. Her death had been extremely violent, and though she had fought hard for her life, tragically, she had been overpowered. Continued searches of William's apartment turned up additional evidence, including a hammer believed to be the primary murder weapon, as well as plastic garbage bags. Testing would show that Andrea's blood and DNA were on all of these items, and her father's DNA was underneath her fingernails. Though William immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to ever really elaborate on why he had killed his own daughter, as well as his unborn grandchild, police would come up with their own ideas after speaking to more of Andrea's loved ones. They explained that things had been incredibly tense between her and her father for quite some time before her death. All of the problems stemmed from money. William had helped Andrea come to the US and buy her house, so he felt like he was owed something. Andrea had given her dad a whole floor of the home, put his name on the deed, and allowed him to live rent-free. But according to friends, it was never enough. William was always trying to get something out of Andrea. He would do things like pretend stuff around the house was broken and ask for cash to hire a repair person, only to pocket the money. In fact, it seemed like William resented all of his children. In his mind, they'd come to America and benefited from his hard work, and he'd ended up with nothing. Though Andrea didn't really care about money, detectives learned that lately, with a baby on the way, she'd been more concerned about her finances. She told her dad he'd have to start contributing to household expenses, and without telling him, she began the process of refinancing the house. Upon hearing this, investigators came up with a theory. William had figured out what Andrea was doing, and he'd snapped. They speculated that sometime on January 3rd, when Lincoln was still asleep, William had lured Andrea into the basement, possibly by pretending that something was wrong with the furnace. When she had her back turned, he attacked her, beating and strangling her to death. If there were any remaining doubts about Lincoln, those went away when police went back into the interview room where he was still being held, and they told him that Andrea had been found. Heartbreakingly, for a moment, the detectives saw a look of happiness wash across Lincoln's face. It only lasted for a split second, though, before he realized what they were actually telling him. That's when Lincoln completely broke down crying. It turned out that he was completely innocent. Not only that, but he lost the love of his life and his unborn child. Unfortunately, because much of the motive surrounding Andrea's killing couldn't be directly proven, when William Carruth went on trial, the jury did not find him guilty of murder. Instead, he was convicted of the lesser crime of first-degree manslaughter. Still, due to his complete lack of remorse, the judge in the case ended up handing him the maximum sentence possible. In October of 2018, William was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At the time of this recording, William Carruth remains incarcerated at New York's Clinton Correctional Facility. According to the latest available information, his earliest eligible release date is in 2037, when he will be 83 years old. On a cold Friday in December of 2014, 37-year-old Alan Schieback was on a trip to Winnipeg, Manitoba with a couple of close friends and coworkers. Though it was more of a work trip than anything, it was a rare bit of travel for the father of two, whose responsibilities as a single dad rarely saw him leave his house, let alone his province. He lived a full 800 miles west in the city of Calgary, Alberta, in a home he shared with his young son and daughter. As Alan and his friends were driving around that day, he realized that he had a missed call and voicemail on his cell phone. He listened to the message, then phoned the male caller back. Though the conversation was fairly brief, within just seconds of hanging up, Alan's friends realized that something was seriously wrong. All of the color had drained from his face, he looked clammy and sweaty, and for a moment, he even stopped breathing. In a concerned tone, one of Alan's friends asked him if he was okay. It looked like he had just seen a ghost. These words would turn out to be a fairly fitting description for what had just happened to the 37-year-old. While he hadn't literally seen a ghost, Alan feared that his past was now coming back to haunt him. Little did he know, this phone call was only the beginning. From the time she was a young child, Lisa Michelle Mitchell was creative and outgoing. According to her mother Peggy, Lisa took a keen interest in drawing around the age of 4, a passion that only deepened when she got a little older and discovered anime. She liked to make original art featuring her favorite characters from Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z, but was also able to draw things from everyday life with impressive realism. By the time she was in high school, Lisa was also into dance and music. She formed an all-girls singing group with some friends, with whom she would spend countless hours making music and accompanying videos in her free time. After finishing school, Lisa worked a series of odd jobs in and around the city of Calgary, Alberta. Despite having less time for her passions after joining the working world, according to Peggy, she never lost that spark of creativity at her core. Even in the most mundane of jobs, she seemed to have a good time and form instant connections with people. One of those people was a man named Alan Scheiback. Lisa met Alan while the two of them were working at the same restaurant in northeastern Calgary. He was a cook and she was a server, and the two of them hit it off and started dating almost immediately. However, not everyone was thrilled about the two of them being together. From the beginning, Peggy struggled to see how the relationship could work. Alan was a few years older and a lot more introverted, and he didn't seem to share a lot of Lisa's interests. He also seemed to be resentful of her social life, and would often get upset with her whenever she went out. Unfortunately, just as Peggy had predicted, when the honeymoon period of the relationship was over, things quickly got rocky between Lisa and Alan. They split up over and over again, but each time they seemed to find a reason to get back together. This was apparently true even when it looked like Lisa was growing tired of repeating the same cycle. Around 5 years into the relationship, she moved back in with her mother and even started dating again. According to Peggy, it seemed like she was doing well. However, after a little while, Alan showed up once again, apologized, and said he wanted Lisa back. She agreed, and not long after, they started a family. The couple had a boy and then a girl, and for a time it seemed like they had worked out their differences. But eventually, the same old problems started to crop up. This time, exacerbated by the new responsibilities of parenthood and the financial difficulties that it brought with it. During this time, Lisa often vented her frustrations to her mother about her home life. She said that Alan had trouble holding down jobs, and that even when he was working, it wasn't enough for them to get by. To compensate, she took care of the kids during the day, then immediately went to one of her 2 jobs at night after Alan came home. Even then, she said it was a struggle, and they fought constantly. Though Peggy told her daughter that she and the kids could come and live with her, Lisa declined. The one thing her and Alan seemed to agree on was their love for their children. They felt obligated to stay together and work things out. Besides, Lisa said the relationship wasn't all bad. She and Alan continued to go through cycles of ups and downs, just as they always had. On October 27th, 2012, Lisa made her usual hour-long drive south from her home in Calgary's Ogden neighborhood to the small village of Longview. The village was where Peggy lived and where Lisa's second job was. She worked as a part-time server at the local Twin Cities Hotel and Saloon. It was a job that had been suggested to her by her mother, who also worked there and had originally taken the job as a way to meet other fellow Longview residents. That night was a special occasion at the bar. It was the Saturday before Halloween, and Twin Cities was hosting its annual party. After grabbing a last-minute costume, Lisa and Peggy headed over to work and started their evening. In interviews, Peggy would later recall that it was a night to remember. She and Lisa spent the entire evening dancing and laughing, and it was one of the best nights they had spent together as mother and daughter. They celebrated all the way until 3 a.m., at which point they decided they would both head back to Peggy's house to sleep for the night. The following morning, the pair got up and planned to have a slow start to the day. They had some coffee, chatted about the previous night's events, and were discussing making brunch, when at around 11 a.m., Lisa suddenly got a phone call. After the brief call, Lisa told her mother that she was sorry, but that she had to leave right away. She didn't explain much, but she said that she was needed at home urgently. After that, she hopped in her truck and started driving back towards Calgary. Though Peggy didn't think much of this at the time, she started to grow concerned a couple of days later, when repeated calls and text messages to Lisa went unanswered. This was extremely out of the ordinary, as the two of them usually talked regularly throughout the week. After a couple of days with no word from her daughter, Peggy decided to drive down to her home and check on her. When she did, she was greeted by Alan. He said that Lisa wasn't there, and that he didn't have any idea where she might be either. According to Alan, on October 29th, the day after Lisa had left Peggy's house, the two of them had gotten into some kind of an argument. He claimed that afterwards, Lisa had asked him to go out for cigarettes, and that when he had returned about 20 minutes later, he realized that she had left. While trying to wrap her head around this news, Peggy spotted something odd while standing at the front door of the house. She could see Lisa's shoes and jacket inside the front hall closet. This immediately stuck out to her as strange. It was almost the beginning of November. Where could Lisa have possibly gone where she wouldn't have wanted her shoes and jacket? With her suspicions now raised, Peggy demanded to see the rest of the house. Just as Alan said, there was no sign of Lisa anywhere, and her purse also appeared to be missing. However, just like the jacket and shoes, there were other items that had seemingly been left behind that stood out to Peggy. Among these were a phoenix necklace and leather wristband that Lisa normally wore any time she left the house. As Peggy was getting ready to leave, Alan remembered one final thing that he said might be of help. Though he didn't know where Lisa was, he said that she had sent him an email. Maybe Peggy should try checking her inbox too. Sure enough, when Peggy got home and got on her computer, she realized that she had received an email from Lisa's address. But the message offered very few details, with Lisa saying that she simply, quote, needed to get away, and that she would be in touch. When Peggy emailed Lisa back, she received replies insisting that everything was fine. They went back and forth over the next couple of weeks, but Lisa still wasn't forthcoming with details about why she had left. It seemed extremely out of character, especially since she had apparently taken off without saying goodbye to her 2 children. Needless to say, despite Lisa's insistence that she was okay, the email exchanges hardly put Peggy's mind at ease. She kept hoping that her daughter would call her and explain what was going on, and started keeping her phone around her at all times, just in case. On November 16th, Peggy awoke to find that she had a missed call and a voicemail. The call had come in at 2:45 that morning, and had been made by a private number, but there was no mistaking it. It was Lisa's voice on the other end. Though Peggy was initially relieved at the sound of her daughter's voice, that feeling almost immediately started to change when she listened to the actual message. It was strange and disjointed, and almost seemed like Lisa might be confused. In it, Lisa said, quote, "Hey, I'm okay. Sometimes my weeks get crazy, and it was quiet for a while, and then all of a sudden this happened, and within half a day, I should, but he's back now and I gotta go. Love you." Peggy had no idea what to think of the strange voicemail. Parts of it didn't seem to make any sense, and even the parts that did were concerning. In particular, who was the he that Lisa was referring to, and why did she suddenly have to go now that he was back? There was one other thing about the message that stuck out to Peggy as well. While she was sure it was Lisa's voice in the call, something about it sounded strange. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, however. One thing was certain, though. With her mind now racing with all sorts of terrible possibilities, Peggy could no longer wait for Lisa to reach out again. It was time to go to the police. When Lisa's disappearance was reported, the case was taken over by the Calgary police. Placed in charge of the investigation was Constable Carl Sudik from the department's Missing Persons Unit. Given the multiple messages Peggy had received since her daughter's disappearance, Sudik and the other investigators were hopeful that they would be able to track Lisa down. They began their search by looking through her phone and banking records to see if anything stood out, and at the same time started talking to those close to her to see if anybody might have additional information. One of the first things that authorities realized is that Lisa had been communicating with a number of people in the lead up to her disappearance. Some of these people were other men, and Lisa also had profiles on a couple of dating sites. This was apparently not news to either Peggy or her common-law husband Alan, who said that infidelity was one of the things that they had struggled with as a couple. When Alan was interviewed by Detective Dave Sweet on January 29, 2013, he opened up more about the troubles in his and Lisa's relationship. He said that money was a constant source of frustration, but that trust had always been the bigger issue. He claimed that Lisa in particular had been unfaithful, and that the on-again, off-again nature of their relationship hadn't helped things. At times, it had led him to wonder if he was even the biological father of his older child. However, Alan maintained that Lisa's disappearance had been a complete surprise to him. He said that it had hit him especially hard because he thought that they had recently come to an understanding that they would stay together for the kids. He told Detective Sweet that prior to this agreement, he had given Lisa an ultimatum. Either things would have to change or she would have to go. Now, it seemed like she had made her decision. Like Peggy had before, police conducted a search of Alan and Lisa's Ogden home, but weren't able to come up with anything that seemed to shed more insight on the case. At the same time, they reached out to the people she had been communicating with through dating sites. Several of them did not live in Calgary, which initially seemed to add some credibility to the idea that maybe Lisa had simply taken off. However, every lead eventually turned into a dead end. As weeks turned into months, Lisa's family started to try and adjust to the new normal of their lives, continuing on as best they could with the uncertainty of her disappearance still hanging over their heads. For Alan, this meant adapting to life as a single father. But after a while, things seemed like they were falling into place. He managed to find steady work after a guy he had met told him about an opening at his friend's new auto brokerage. The pair became fast friends, and pretty soon the friend's girlfriend was even babysitting Alan's kids whenever he worked late or was in a tight spot. For a brief moment, it even looked like Alan might have a new woman in his life. The pair met when she backed into his car in a parking lot while he was at work. Initially, Alan was irritated by the situation, but the woman explained that it was an accident due to bad weather, and that it was a company car, so her boss would pay for the whole thing. In addition to paying for the minor damage to Alan's vehicle, he was given hockey tickets for his trouble, and he and the woman kept in touch. They spoke about the difficult situations in their lives over a meal together, and Alan asked her out. She said it wasn't good timing. She was taking care of her sick mother, and she had just gotten out of a bad relationship herself. But still, to those in Alan's life, it seemed like he was getting back out there. In early December of 2014, Alan accompanied a couple of his friends to Winnipeg, Manitoba for a short work trip. It had now been more than 2 years since Lisa's disappearance, and this was supposed to be the first real time he was getting away from his day-to-day life. It was during this trip, on December 5th, however, that everything would fall apart, beginning with a single voicemail. That voicemail was from Detective Dave Sweet, who asked Alan to call him back. When he did, the detective gave him some completely unexpected news. Sweet explained that he had now taken over the Lisa Mitchell investigation, and it was no longer a missing persons case. Authorities now believed they were dealing with a homicide. What's more, they had obtained a warrant and at that moment were preparing to search Alan's home. What Alan hadn't realized was that for more than a year, police had been gathering evidence against him, and the situation wasn't looking good. It had started in 2013 with a change to Alberta's Missing Persons Act, which gave police new useful search powers and opened up additional avenues of investigation. One of these new powers provided police with more detailed information pertaining to phone records. In particular, investigators zeroed in on the strange phone message that Peggy had received from Lisa in the weeks after her disappearance. Though the phone call had been made from a private number, police now knew that the phone was a cheap pay-as-you-go model that had only been activated for a month around the time Peggy received the mysterious call. It turned out that the phone had only been used to make 5 calls in the period it was active, 1 to Peggy and 4 to Alan Schieback. Except, here's the thing. Unlike Peggy, Alan had never mentioned these calls to police. Even more suspicious, cell tower information was able to narrow down the area where the call to Peggy had come from. It had been made somewhere in the vicinity of Alan and Lisa's Ogden home. Keep in mind, though, this was on November 16th, well over 2 weeks after Lisa was already supposed to have gone missing. If she had indeed run off, why would she still be making calls close to the house? While this information didn't prove foul play on its own, it was enough to suggest to police that Alan was hiding something from them. It was also enough evidence to give police the grounds they needed to investigate Alan further. Bank records revealed that around the time of Lisa's disappearance, Alan had made a number of unusual purchases at local stores. Police were able to obtain copies of the receipts for these items, which included a large Rubbermaid tub, bleach, gloves, cement, a mixing bucket, a 4x2 sheet of plywood, and some cat litter. As far as investigators were concerned, there was no innocent explanation for why Alan would be buying some of these items. For instance, he didn't own a cat and was actually extremely allergic. Instead, when taken together, authorities believe the items added up to a clandestine burial kit. As for the cell phone that made the call to Peggy, authorities weren't able to find a receipt, though they were able to find something interesting in Alan's bank records. It turned out that he had made a $40 cash withdrawal at a Walmart where he had purchased several of the other items. When police looked up the exact type of pay-as-you-go cell phone that had made the call to Peggy, they were able to determine that the cost for the phone and a month of activation added up to almost exactly that amount. After receiving the phone call from Detective Sweet in Winnipeg, Alan was noticeably distressed. Immediately, he asked to stop for a cigarette, and he began to hyperventilate. When his friends asked him what was going on, he said that he had something he needed to tell them. He knew that he was in trouble. Alan explained that 2 years prior, on October 29th, he and Lisa had gotten into one of their usual fights. He said that he couldn't remember what it was about, but that it had started the second Lisa had gotten home from her mother's house the previous day, and had just continued on. He claimed that things had gotten more and more heated between them until Lisa had turned towards him while holding a chef's knife. He said that she had then started to threaten him, saying that she could probably put him in the hospital, could claim it was self-defense, and that everyone would take her side. She would end up with the kids and everything else, and he would end up in jail. He said he couldn't remember for sure, and that he now had doubts, but he was pretty sure she had motioned towards him with the knife. He managed to wrestle the blade away from her and push her down onto the floor. After he did, he started choking her. He kept going long after she had passed out and stopped struggling, and even after he said that he knew Lisa was dead. He said what he remembered most of all was trying to force himself to let go. Afterwards, he said that he had hidden Lisa's body in his house. After making this disturbing confession, Alan repeated the details in a second conversation with another friend. He wanted the friend's advice because the man had previously confided in him about a time he had been involved in a fatal car crash while he had been drinking. The man had told Alan that he had gotten out of the situation by moving his deceased friend, who had been killed in the collision, into the driver's seat. When asked about Lisa's body, Alan made it clear that if police searched his home thoroughly, he would be going to jail. He then began to mull over his options. The way he saw it, he had 3 choices. He could go on the run, try to get a hold of a lawyer who was good enough to stop the police from searching his home, or he could torch the place before investigators could get there. He referred to this last option as being, quote, a little dicey though, saying that a simple fire probably wouldn't be enough. He'd have to blow the place up, he explained. Maybe make it look like a gas leak. Eventually, though, after going around in circles for some time, Allen decided that running was probably his best option. The only problem was that he would never get his chance. Though Allen knew he was living one lie, i.e., pretending not to know anything about Lisa's disappearance, he was completely oblivious to a second deception that by this point was all around him. You see, for the past entire year, nearly his whole social life had been a fabrication created by undercover police officers who were investigating Lisa's disappearance. The person who had gotten him the job at the auto brokerage? An undercover officer. The people he had befriended at work, who he was now confessing to in Winnipeg? Undercover officers. The woman who had accidentally hit him with her car. Turns out that wasn't an accident at all. The whole thing was staged. She was actually the very first undercover officer to make contact with Allen and had been used to connect him with others who would get even closer. Even the person who had been babysitting his kids was part of the undercover team. The whole thing was called Operation Aurora and was a modified version of a police procedure known as Mr. Big. Essentially, Mr. Big is a covert police tactic in which undercover officers develop elaborate fake relationships and contrived situations which are designed to elicit a confession from a suspect. In most cases, the suspect is enticed into joining a fake criminal organization by the officers, and once they are integrated into it and have developed trust, they are encouraged to share information about their prior criminal history. This is usually done in front of the fake crime boss of this bogus organization, hence the name Mr. Big. Mr. Big is a controversial tactic for many reasons, with many critics saying that it essentially amounts to entrapment. In fact, the procedure is actually illegal in many countries, including the United States. However, in Canada, where it is perhaps the most popularly used, it is not. In the case of Allen Scheibach, authorities slightly modified the Mr. Big procedure. Because Allen had no prior criminal history, police didn't think he would be enticed to join an illegal organization. Instead, they got close to him until they thought they had developed enough trust, took him to Winnipeg so that he was far enough away from home, and baited him with the call from Detective Sweet. Their theory was that the call would be enough to induce panic in Allen, and that he would confess to the officers who he now believed were his close friends. This is precisely what happened. During his conversations where he described killing Lisa in detail, officers were secretly recording. Not long after, Allen was arrested. On December 6, 2014, the day after Detective Sweet's phone call, police began a thorough search of Allen Scheibach's home. In particular, they were now focused on the basement. Though this area of the property had been searched before, it had initially seemed like just a normal basement. There was junk piled everywhere, and nothing of great interest stuck out. However, based on Allen's bank records, they now believed they knew what they needed to look for. In one of the corners of the basement, there was a triangular concrete ledge that was stacked with boxes and other random items. When investigators removed them, they noticed that the concrete appeared to have been poured at a different time than the rest of the basement's foundation. The ledge was also approximately 4 feet across and 2 feet high, the same dimensions of the piece of wood that they knew Allen had purchased shortly after Lisa's disappearance. They theorized that Allen had propped the wood up in the corner, using it as a mold to pour the concrete. As authorities started excavating the ledge, they noticed something below the surface of the concrete. It was the top of a Rubbermaid container, the same type that they also knew Allen had purchased. The bin had been duct taped shut. When the container was fully removed from the concrete, police were horrified by what they found. Inside were the remains of Lisa Mitchell. She was in the fetal position and had been covered by layers of salt and cat litter, which had essentially mummified her body. While the state of decomposition made it difficult to examine Lisa's remains, a medical examiner determined that she had died of probable manual strangulation, which lined up with Allen's taped confession. In addition to Lisa's body, investigators soon uncovered the final pieces of evidence that they were missing. Allen's internet search history shortly after Lisa's death revealed that he had looked up how body decomposition is affected by various things, including lye, salt, concrete, lack of air, and lack of insect activity. Months before his arrest, Allen conducted similar searches and also looked up murder legislation in Canada. As for the emails and phone call that had been received after Lisa's death, Allen had been behind them all along. Sending the emails had been as simple as breaking into Lisa's account. The phone call required more effort, but was straightforward enough to figure out. It turned out that Allen had installed spyware on Lisa's phone well before he killed her, and had been using the software to listen and record her communications for some time. It was these recordings that he had spliced together into the mysterious phone message, which he played into the phone after calling Peggy. In April of 2017, Allen Scheibach stood trial on charges of second-degree murder and causing indignity to a human body. He opted for a judge-only trial, in which he took the stand and admitted to killing Lisa. Despite this admission, Allen claimed that he had never meant for Lisa to die. He said that he felt immense guilt, but believed that he had acted in self-defense. He and his lawyer also argued that he had been a victim of domestic abuse at the hands of his common-law wife for years. The prosecution, meanwhile, argued that Allen's actions were cold and calculated. They believed that the evidence showed that he very much had intended to kill Lisa, and pointed to things like the way he had spied on her prior to her death, as well as the elaborate cover-up that followed. They also argued that the abuse in the relationship was mutual, and that Allen was as much a perpetrator as he was a victim. At the end of the trial, Justice Rosemary Nation said that she could not convict Allen of second-degree murder because she was left with reasonable doubt as to his intent. She stated that because of the condition of Lisa's remains, it was also difficult to establish the timing and circumstances of what had happened. However, she rejected the idea that Allen had killed in self-defense. Judge Nation stated that by Allen's own admission, he had continued attacking Lisa well after the knife was no longer in her possession, and she was on the floor, when Allen had no reasonable fear for his life. Instead, she found him guilty of manslaughter, sentencing him to 5 years for that crime, and a further 2 years for causing indignity to a human body. Feeling that this was unjustly lenient, the prosecution appealed the sentence, taking it to the Alberta Court of Appeal. The court ultimately agreed with the prosecution, ruling that Justice Nation had failed to properly categorize the seriousness of Allen Scheibach's crime in the overall scale of manslaughter crimes. However, they decided to add just 3 years to the overall sentence, bringing the total up to 10, but still falling short of the 12 to 15 that Crown prosecutors had recommended. Because Allen had been in jail since the time of his arrest in 2014, it wasn't long after the appeal decision in 2018 that he had officially served half of his sentence. He was released on day parole in 2019, though that was briefly revoked after he was found to be in violation of the terms of his release. According to the most recent information we could find, it appears that Allen Scheibach was granted statutory release in April of 2022, after completing 2/3 of his sentence. When asked for comment prior to his release, Peggy said in an interview, quote, "We can't change anything. We have to go forward. We are living well and enjoying life. We cherish every moment." She has been raising Lisa's children since Allen's arrest and says that they are doing well and would make their mother very proud. Just after 8 o'clock on the evening of August 2nd, 2010, a security guard in Pickering, Ontario was making his usual rounds when he spotted something strange. The man was part of a team tasked with patrolling a large section of government-owned property called the airport lands. As the name suggests, the land had once been set aside for the construction of a new airport. However, protests and other political wrangling had stalled the project for decades, effectively killing it. Since then, the rural land, which was dotted with decrepit farms and houses, had mostly sat vacant. As is the case with many places that sit unoccupied for so long, the area had eventually attracted its fair share of unwanted nighttime activity. Most of this had been the usual stuff you'd expect: vandalism, teenagers growing pot, that kind of stuff. However, security had been hired after a string of arsons at several of the abandoned properties, which was understandably taken more seriously by authorities. Still, it was mostly a losing battle, since there were thousands of acres to patrol and only ever a handful of security guards on duty at most. On this particular night, though, while driving near Concession 7 Road and Sideline 32, The security guard spotted something that he had never seen before. It was a gray Mercedes that had been left parked on the side of the road. There was no one inside, and the only other landmark within reasonable walking distance was a dilapidated farmhouse, which, like most of the residences around there, had long since been abandoned. Since a luxury vehicle was a fairly uncommon sight in this area, the security guard decided to wait around a bit to see if the owner would return. 2 hours went by. However, he didn't see anyone, and eventually he was forced to continue on with his rounds. By the time he came back to the location later in his shift at about 3:30 a.m., the car was gone. There were no signs of any criminal activity, so the security guard quickly put the situation out of his mind. Fast forward to more than a year later in November of 2011, when a team of contractors were sent out to the airport lands. Several of the abandoned properties in the area had been scheduled for demolition, and as part of the preparations, these crews were now being sent out to conduct inspections to make sure that everything was in order. One of these properties was an old farmhouse on Concession 7 Road, close to the intersection with Sideline 32. It was set back a distance from the road, and the land was only accessible by foot since its driveway had long since been barricaded with concrete blocks. After approaching the residence, the workers realized that the only way in was through the door of a wooden structure attached to the main house. At one point, it might have served as a garage or a barn, but now it was the only part of the building that hadn't been either boarded up or completely overtaken by trees, bushes, and thick patches of long grass. Immediately upon entering, though, the workers were surprised to find that the place showed signs of activity. In the middle of the garage/barn was what looked like someone's workbench, and the thing had clearly been recently painted. Walking through a little farther, the workers encountered a door, behind which was a cement staircase that led to a basement underneath the main house. At the bottom of the stairs was a second door, which they opened, only to be greeted by yet another door. This final door was not like the others, though. It had been custom made out of multiple sheets of plywood, and was at least 3 inches thick. It had locks made of tire irons. Chillingly, ones that had clearly been designed so that this door could only be unlocked and opened from the outside. After seeing what was behind the last door, the workers immediately called 911. When officers from the Durham police responded to the scene, they were likewise disturbed by what they found in that basement room of the abandoned farmhouse. The whole place was painted white, aside from the floor, which was tiled, and a roughly constructed bench was the only furniture inside. The work on the room had obviously not been done that long ago, owing to a paint tray that had been left in the corner, which still smelled strongly, and 2 cartons of soy milk with recent expiry dates. The final 2 features of the room were far and away the most terrifying, though. Lengths of chain that had been bolted to the ceiling and which extended to the floor, as well as several jugs of water, enough to keep a person alive for several weeks at least. There was no other way around it. Someone had clearly constructed this room for the purposes of confining another human being. The only saving grace appeared to be that the room had been found before it could be used by its creator. After coming to terms with this horrifying realization, Durham police began to scour the place for clues. Aside from the empty soy cartons, there wasn't much to go on, except for some tools with distinctive red paint blots on them, as well as a men's volunteer shirt from a Toronto World Youth Day event from several years ago. When news of the grim discovery was released to the public, people were understandably scared. The property became known as the Pickering Dungeon House, and widespread speculation began about the sinister intentions of the person who had built that secret room. Appeals were released by police, hoping that new information could be found. 2 months later, the situation got even more spooky, when it was announced that the dungeon house had burned down under suspicious circumstances. People wondered, was it just the latest property to be targeted by random vandals, or was this someone trying to cover their tracks? Finally, police caught a lucky break in February of 2012, when the connection was made between the Pickering Dungeon House and the security guard who had spotted the out-of-place Mercedes in the area 2 summers earlier. Fortunately, the security guard had jotted down the vehicle's license plate information. When authorities looked it up, it led them to a 45-year-old man named Robert Edwin White. At first, Robert seemed like the last person police expected to be constructing a dungeon in an old farmhouse. The 45-year-old was a devoutly religious married father of two, one who ran a successful business and had no prior criminal record. However, as authorities began to scratch below the surface, they discovered some things that were concerning. For starters, the business Robert was involved in was contracting, so he definitely had the skills to construct the room. He was also known to drink soy milk and had a habit of marking his tools with similar red paint blots to the ones that police had found at the scene. Investigators also learned that though Robert was currently married, he had been through a nasty divorce with his ex-wife Patricia back in the spring of 2008. The divorce had ended with Robert losing custody of both of his children after Patricia had accused Robert of being abusive during their relationship. When police asked Patricia about the evidence they had found in the Pickering dungeon house, her blood ran cold. She was able to confirm all of the details that they had found related to her ex-husband at the property, including the World Youth Day volunteer shirt, which she said Robert had gotten in 2002. While this evidence was enough to arrest Robert and charge him with attempted kidnapping as well as breaking and entering, the full story behind what had happened and why wouldn't come out until the case went to court several months later. You see, contrary to what police initially believed, Robert had not made the room to confine Patricia, but instead for her best friend Gwen. It turned out that Robert had been harboring a grudge against Gwen for years and believed that she was the cause of all of his problems. In court testimony, Robert revealed that he blamed Gwen not only for the failure of his marriage with Patricia, but also for the fact that he had lost his kids. In the aftermath of the divorce, Gwen and her husband had welcomed Patricia and the kids into their home since they had been close family friends forever. Robert, however, viewed this as an attempt by Gwen to steal his children. He felt that his suspicions were confirmed when, during the divorce, Gwen and her husband had been appointed to temporarily supervise his visits with his children. For the next 18 months, Robert had devoted his spare time to constructing the dungeon in the Pickering farmhouse after discovering the property on a drive one day. Though Robert claimed in court that he had never planned to actually confine anyone in the room he had built, authorities did not buy this. By this point, a couple of family members had also come forward claiming that Robert had mentioned wanting to get back at Gwen numerous times since his divorce, and at one point had even said something about trying to extort a ransom from her husband, though afterwards attempted to play this off like a joke. As a result, authorities argued that the only thing that had stopped Robert from going through with his terrifying plot was the fact that the room had been discovered before he was fully finished the construction. Robert ultimately agreed to plead guilty to a charge of breaking and entering with the intent to commit an indictable offense, after prosecutors withdrew the attempted kidnapping charge. As a result, he was sentenced to just 2 years in prison. At his sentencing hearing, Robert appeared to express a great deal of remorse for what had happened, saying that he realized his actions had irreparably damaged his family. However, he still seemed to blame his ex-wife and Gwen for what had happened, saying that his family issues had pushed him to the brink. Patricia and Gwen, meanwhile, said that they would never be able to fully come to terms with what had happened. Patricia stated that she and her children were all now in therapy following the revelations, while Gwen said that she would never be able to get the images of the makeshift dungeon out of her head. I, for one, can't blame her. Imagine finding out that someone had spent the last year and a half building a homemade jail cell just for you, where they planned to take you and do God knows what to you once you were there. And then the only reason the plan was discovered was because of a massive coincidence. It's truly one of the most disturbing things I've ever heard. As a side note, Robert's new wife also divorced him after learning what he had done for obvious reasons, and though police were suspicious about the arson, it appears that part of the case was never solved. Given that this all happened more than a decade ago, it's safe to say Robert has long since been released from prison. In 1961, a man named George Carroll went missing from his home in Lake Grove, New York. George was a Korean War veteran who had purchased the property in 1955 with his wife Dorothy as a place to raise their growing family. Now that family had seemingly been torn apart overnight. George was in his late 20s when he disappeared, leaving behind 4 young children. 9-year-old Patricia, 7-year-old John, 5-year-old Stephen, and 8-month-old Michael. According to Dorothy, her husband had walked out on the family. As a result, no missing persons report was ever filed for George. Growing up, the Carroll children quickly learned not to ask too many questions about their father's absence. Dorothy didn't want to talk about the situation and would never provide a straight answer about George's disappearance, beyond saying that he had gone out one day and never returned. It seemed that despite the upsetting situation, she had managed to move on with her life, getting together with a man named Richard Darris not long after her husband's disappearance. The two would eventually marry and have another child. However, Dorothy's unwillingness to talk about her missing husband did little to quell the curiosity of her growing children, or stop rumors from cropping up in the rest of the family. Some believed that George had simply run away like Dorothy said, possibly back to where he had served in the Korean War. Others, however, thought there might have been a more sinister explanation. In the 1980s, Dorothy's youngest son, Michael, purchased the family home from her. This would turn out to be a fateful decision, though one that would take several more decades to fully realize. It was after Dorothy's death in 1998 that the Carroll children really started to entertain the darkest possible explanation for their father's sudden disappearance. That he had never really left them at all. This theory was one that had been whispered amongst family members for years. Specifically, that perhaps George was buried somewhere in the basement. Though the thought was certainly morbid, it wasn't simply random speculation. At the time that George had gone missing, construction was being done on the family house. Part of this included pouring new concrete in the basement. Eventually, the rumors became too much for Michael, who decided that he was going to try and settle the mystery once and for all. In his search for answers, he even reached out to a psychic, as well as a team of paranormal investigators. He was told that there was a lot of energy emanating from his basement. In 2015, he finally began digging. It was a slow process, as he initially chose to dig alone, and only worked on the project periodically. When he eventually used ground-penetrating radar, though, to analyze the basement floor, the results seemed to suggest that he was on the right track. They indicated that there could be something 6 feet below. After Michael suffered a stroke in the summer of 2018, his 2 sons joined in on the dig, and on October 30th, they found what they were looking for: a human skeleton. Michael informed his siblings of his discovery that night and told Suffolk County Police the following day. 2 months later, the family got the news that they had been waiting on for nearly 60 years. The bones discovered in the basement of the house were positively identified as belonging to George Carroll. According to the Suffolk County Medical Examiner, the DNA was extremely well preserved within George's skeletal remains, making for an easy identification. However, it was clear that the news had only solved half of the mystery surrounding George's death. An analysis of the remains led investigators to conclude that George had been murdered, dying as a result of blunt force trauma to the head. Though the death had been declared a homicide, police had little to go on in terms of finding those responsible. Whatever secrets Dorothy had about the disappearance were long since lost with her death in 1998. The last remaining person who might have had any information about George's death was Dorothy's second husband, Richard Darris, and he had passed away earlier in 2018. Despite the lack of any official conclusion to the case, the Carroll children told reporters at the time that they were happy enough with the answers they had gotten, and didn't want to speculate any further about what might have led to their father ending up where he did. Michael Carroll described feeling total peace after his discovery, saying, quote, "I feel great that my dad is finally free from that crappy hole." In the fall of 2019, George's body was laid to rest at the Calverton National Cemetery in Riverhead, New York. As of the time of this recording, it seems no other updates have been provided in the case. On December 21st, 1985, James Nichols told police that his wife Joanne had gone missing from their home in Poughkeepsie, New York. The news came as a shock to many people in the community. Though James was sometimes avoided because of his strange and somewhat unsettling behavior, Joanne was well liked by her neighbors. The 55-year-old Louisiana native was known for her warm southern charm, as well as her devotion to her church. She was a beloved first-grade teacher who made a big deal out of the first day of school and brought in cupcakes for her students on their birthdays. To those that knew Joanne, it seemed bizarre that she would simply take off. It was no surprise then that attention naturally turned towards James following Joanne's disappearance. He told police that they had eaten dinner with another couple the night before and had come home after an argument. The next morning, he had gone out to buy dog food and returned to find his wife missing. James also showed police a note that had been typed on one of their computers, which he said had been left by Joanne. It explained that she was depressed after the death of their son, who had died in a boating accident 3 years earlier at the age of 25. James theorized that Joanne had either joined a religious cult, she had taken her own life, or she had simply left him. However, to many people, none of these explanations made sense. For starters, Joanne did not seem the type to run away. Neighbors said that though she was bothered by her husband's behavior at times, their marriage seemed to be fairly peaceful overall, and there were no major signs of trouble. It was true that she had been depressed about the death of their son, but not to the point where it seemed like she would do anything drastic. While police continued to search wooded areas and waterways in the surrounding community, they also spent time following James. Subsequently, their investigation uncovered a couple of strange things. First, on the day that Joanne was reported missing, her car was also gone, and it was presumed that she had taken it with her. However, the following day, detectives noticed the vehicle back in the driveway of the Nichols residence. James claimed that he had found Joanne's car parked at a local shopping center and had it cleaned and vacuumed. While watching James, investigators also discovered that he had been seeing another woman. When presented with photographs of the two of them together, James became immediately defensive and referred all future questions to his lawyer. Though the findings certainly seemed incriminating, police never uncovered enough evidence to serve him with a search warrant, nor was he ever arrested or even publicly named as a suspect in Joanne's disappearance. In the years that followed, rumors swirled about James, and he became increasingly more reclusive. Neighbors rarely saw him leave his property, except for the rare occasion when he would attend roast beef dinners at the local Methodist church. During this time, Joanne's brother, John Miller, spent almost $150,000 on a private detective to investigate his sister's disappearance. Though he was never able to find significant enough evidence to solve the case, he did succeed in preventing Joanne from being declared legally dead. This may have stopped James from being able to sell his house, which was also in Joanne's name. As the years passed, the home fell into increasingly worse states of disrepair, as James continued to clutter it with items he hoarded and collected. His appearances in public became less and less frequent, until finally, on December 27, 2012, he was found dead inside his residence at the age of 82. It seemed that whatever secrets James may have known about Joanne's disappearance, he had taken them with him to his grave. However, when a cleanup crew arrived at the Nichols house 6 months later, they made a shocking discovery. Upon wading through the massive items in the basement, they noticed a peculiar-looking wall in the basement. This turned out to be a false wall, concealing a barrel-shaped container behind it. Inside the container were the skeletal remains of a woman. It took police just a short time after that to confirm what many people had suspected for decades. James had killed Joanne and lived in the house with her hidden remains for nearly 30 years. An autopsy revealed that Joanne had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head. As horrifying as the case was, many of those who had known Joanne were happy to receive closure, including her nephew, Randy Miller. Sadly, John Miller passed away before he ever found out what had happened to his sister.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.